Reporting from Arkham Asylum, this is Gotham Rogues. In this video we explore the history of the King of Conundrums himself, the Riddler. I thought I'd begin the year with a brand new series, one I've been wanting to do for a while. It's essentially a lot like my Forgotten and Underrated Rogues videos, but with the actual big villains. It's mainly aimed at people who are interested in these characters, but don't know a whole lot about them. However, I hope you experts can find some enjoyment in these videos as well. Anyway, so as you probably gathered, I decided to start off with none other than that Prince of Puzzlers, the Wizard of Quiz himself, Edward Nigma, better known to the world at large as the Riddler. The early 1940s saw the introductions of many of Batman's most iconic foes, like the Joker, the Scarecrow, and the Penguin. But this string of villainous debuts came to a halt after Two-Face's introduction in 1942. Subsequent villains just didn't really stick, at least not in the long run. However, by 1948, it was time again to pit the Dark Knight against a brand new rogue who would stand the test of time. The Riddler made his smashing debut in Detective Comics 140 with a cover date of October 1948. Incidentally, that very same month saw the introduction of yet another staple Bat-villain, namely the Mad Hatter. Anyway, Detective Comics 140 featured a story written by Bill Finger and penciled by Dick Sprang, simply titled The Riddler. In it we meet a young boy named Edward Nigma, although he looks to be in his late 40s. One day at school, Eddie's teacher announces a jigsaw puzzle contest, and determined to win, Edward sneaks into school at night, breaks open his teacher's desk, and takes a picture of the finished puzzle inside. Knowing what the puzzle is supposed to look like, Edward easily beats the other kids at the contest and wins a prize. Encouraged by this experience, Nigma continues to play with rigged puzzles as he grows up, and nabs a job at a Gotham carnival. Eventually, Eddie grows tired of such a small-time gig and begins to aspire for far greater exploits, realizing that with his cunning and dishonest methods, he could baffle the Gotham Police Department and even the Batman himself. Thus, Edward Nigma decides to embark upon a life of crime as a costumed supervillain. He dons the moniker of the Riddler, the King of Conundrums, and starts a daring crime spree, cluing Batman in on his capers with cryptic riddles. It's not enough for him to steal, he must also prove his intellectual superiority. The Prince of Puzzlers returned just 2 months later in Detective Comics 142 in a story called Crime's Puzzle Contest. The Riddler once again launches a daring crime spree in Gotham City, challenging Batman and Robin to a second duel of the wits. These two comics would turn out to be the only appearances Riddler made for a very long time. The character was completely absent during the 1950s and first half of the 60s. He simply vanished into obscurity and became a forgotten Batman villain, lost to time. However, as it turned out, this was merely the calm before the storm for Edward Nigma. In 1965, after a 17-year-long absence, writer Gardner Fox and penciler Sheldon Moldoff decided to bring back the King of Conundrums, which turned out to be a very fateful decision. The comeback took place in a story titled The Remarkable Ruse of the Riddler, published in Batman 171. Eddie was now finally back to duel the dynamic duo, more devious than ever. Around the same time, 20th Century Fox tasked producer William Dozier with creating a TV series based upon the character of Batman. Dozier had never read a single comic in his life, and in order to prepare himself, went out and picked up whichever issues of Batman and Detective were on the stands at the time. Among those issues was presumably Batman 171, as Dozier had screenwriter Lorenzo Semple Jr. write the pilot for the show as an adaptation of The Remarkable Ruse of the Riddler. Talk about sheer random luck. The Riddler, who had just previously been a forgotten Bat-villain for 17 years, just happens to make his unexpected comeback at the very moment Dozier is looking for comics to adapt. Due to this one-in-a-million happenstance, the Riddler of all rogues got to be the very first Batman villain to make the transition from the comic book page into another form of medium. The two-part pilot episode named Hi Diddle Riddle Smack in the Middle aired in 1966 and featured actor Frank Gorshin in the role of the Puzzle Fiend. He went on to play the character for the rest of the show, except for in season 2, in which Riddler only appeared once, played by John Astin. Gorshin also portrayed Riddler in the 1967 spin-off feature film Batman the Movie, which marked the character's jump from TV to the big screen. In the film, Riddler teams up with the other main villains from the series, Penguin, Catwoman, and Joker. Frank Gorshin's Riddler turned out to be one of the breakout characters from the show, and was arguably its most memorable and iconic villain. This was mainly due to his bizarre and nonsensical riddles, as well as Gorshin's scene-stealing performance. In the role, Gorshin would make sudden switches between a cackling, maniacal goofball and a stone-cold, dead-serious psycho. Riddler, an obscure villain from the Golden Age, was now suddenly catapulted into the mainstream, becoming a pop culture icon and household name. Now suddenly even your grandma knew who the Prince of Puzzlers was. He even got his own song, sung by Gorshin himself. Like overnight, Riddler was everywhere, on the TV, the silver screen, and even on your radio. In 1968, the character expanded his domain further by making the transition to animation. He was featured on the Batman-Superman Hour, a series featuring Batman's first ever cartoon shorts, bundled together with old Superman and Superboy segments. On the show, the King of Conundrums was voiced by Ted Knight, who did the voice work for all the villains, except for Catwoman of course, as well as Alfred and Commissioner Gordon. For the Riddler's voice, Knight utilized a really bizarre speech pattern, which can't really be explained. You've gotta listen to it yourself. Meanwhile, over in the good old comics, Nigma, who had only made 3 appearances before the live-action TV show, was now featured in numerous issues every year. He had risen to the ranks of Batman's top foes, an A-lister all of a sudden, rubbing elbows with the Joker and the Penguin. In the same week of 1966, as a pilot episode of the show aired, the comics also gave the Riddler his first character study. By no accident, I should gather. Naturally, DC Comics wanted to capitalize on this rising star. The story was published in Batman 179, entitled The Riddler's Robberies of the Riddler. It was done by the same team, indirectly responsible for Nigma's sudden stardom, Gardner Fox and Sheldon Moldoff. In the story, it's explained that Edward's riddle gimmick is actually a form of compulsory behavior. He has to leave a riddle before each crime, otherwise he can't go through with the deed. It's a severe mental issue. The 60s was without a doubt the most important decade for the Riddler, at the risk of repeating myself, but this was the time when the old forgotten nobody Eddie Nigma out of the blue became one of the most well-known and popular fictional villains, and not just in comics, but across all forms of media. How can anybody not be impressed by such a story? It's nothing short of a miracle. However, the glory days wouldn't last forever, at least not when it came to Edward's home of DC Comics. When the popularity of the live-action Batman TV series began to wane in the late 60s, and the show was even cancelled after its 3rd season in 1968, DC wanted to distance themselves from its campy and goofy style. Instead, they opted to return the jolly caped crusader to his grim Dark Knight roots. One of the things the show was most known for was its colorful and over-the-top villains. As such, DC editor Julius Schwartz put an embargo on all rogues who had appeared on the TV series, forbidding his writers like Dennis O'Neil and Frank Robbins from using them. This included the Joker, the Penguin, Catwoman, and of course the Riddler. Edward Nigma made his last appearance in Detective Comics 377, published in 1968, and he wouldn't return for another 7 years. In 1973, Julius Schwartz began to loosen his Bat-villain embargo by allowing for the use of the Joker, and by 1974, the embargo had been completely lifted. Penguin and Catwoman had made their comebacks in the Batman books by then, but poor Eddie had to wait another year. It was writer Dennis O'Neil and penciler Ernie Chan who brought him back in Batman 263, published in 1975. The story was called Riddler on the Move and featured the Prince of Puzzlers back to form. After this comic, Nigma thrived yet again and returned as one of Batman's chief foes. There were Riddlers everywhere, and one comic cover even touted him as your favorite Bat-villain. Meanwhile, during this second streak of success, Eddie showed up in his second animated incarnation when he began to appear on the 3rd season of the cartoon show Super Friends in 1978. This time the character was voiced by Michael Bell, and throughout the run of this series, Riddler was primarily portrayed as a member of the Legion of Doom, a collection of the hero's worst enemies, including such vile knaves as Lex Luthor, Captain Cold, Sinestro, Cheetah, and fellow Bat-Rogue the Scarecrow. Frank Gorshin reprised his role as Riddler in 2 television specials called Legends of the Superheroes, which aired in 1979. Adam West and Burt Ward also reprised their roles as Batman and Robin, respectively. In the early 1980s, Nigma continued to appear regularly in the comics, but it would soon become apparent that this second win of his had merely been temporary. The Riddler was about to enter the absolute low point of his career. Eddie made his last big appearance for quite some time in 1983 and was for several years relegated to mere cameos. If DC wanted to distance themselves from the Batman TV show in the early 70s, now they really wanted nothing to do with it. By the mid to late 1980s, Batman had been totally transformed. Long gone was the campy Adam West depiction, and in its place stood a grim avenger of the night. Comic book storylines like The Dark Knight Returns from 1986, Year One from 87, and The Killing Joke from 88 redefined Batman and the world he inhabited for a new era. Gotham City was no longer a bright place full of happy citizens, instead it was a seedy town of corruption and darkness. But where would the Riddler fit into all of this? The rogue who was made famous by the goofy TV series. In a lot of ways, the Prince of Puzzlers symbolized the show. With contempt for the old series growing among the fans and even creators, so did it for poor Eddie as well. He was seen as a relic of the corny times and was treated as such. As mentioned, the character was more or less ignored after 1983, appearing only in a half a dozen or so cameos. That is until 1989. 1989 was a big year for Batman. He was celebrating his 50th anniversary, and the first live-action movie since Batman the movie was released, featuring a dark and serious tone akin to the contemporary comics. The film was a massive success, further establishing the Dark Knight as a pop culture giant. The year also saw the introduction of the third Robin, Tim Drake, and the launch of the first new solo Batman book since 1940, namely Legends of the Dark Knight. Needless to say, it was a good year for old Bats. It was not, however, a good year for Mr. Nigma. The disdain for the character seemed to reach a boiling point in '89. The comics finally brought him back for bigger roles, but it was only to humiliate the hapless bastard. It began with Dennis O'Neil and Bill Ray's story, Riddles, published in The Question number 26. In this comic it's revealed that Edward Nigma, whose real name is apparently Edward Nashton, never was one of Batman's greatest foes. It's only been in his own imagination. The deluded fool thinks that he's the Dark Knight's nemesis, but in reality he's been nothing but a minor nuisance to both Batman and the police this whole time. Or to quote Commissioner Gordon from the comic, "You were and are a minor leaguer with a gimmick." Next up was the one-shot issue Secret Origins special, which featured 3 Bat-villain anthology stories, one for the Penguin, one for Two-Face, and of course one for Eddie. The framework for the issue deals with a news crew doing a piece on Gotham's costumed criminals. The Riddler actually calls the crew up and offers to appear for an interview, but they've never even heard of the guy. Eventually they agree to the interview, which is then Nigma's segment of the issue, written by Neil Gaiman. It turns out that Edward's retired from crime and now takes care of a junkyard full of old, elaborate billboards, an obvious homage to Silver Age Batman comics. While this story is a bit more respectful to the character and also serves as a love letter to the Silver Age and the 60s TV show, it still portrays Riddler as a total has-been, who apparently never really was that big of a villain to begin with. I think '89 Riddler can be perfectly summed up by his Who's Who profile from that year, published in Detective Comics Annual number 2. Just take a look at this part from his read-up. The Riddler is psychologically incapable of committing any crime without first sending a riddle clue to Batman or the police. Okay, I agree with that, but then see what follows this statement. The Riddler is fully aware of this character trait and makes his riddles particularly complex and difficult. But it is this same fatal flaw that has prevented him from becoming one of Batman's greater foes, and has forever relegated him to the status of second-class criminal. Then take a look at what it says under his powers and weapons. The Riddler has no superhuman powers, but he is a criminal strategist of some cunning. Some cunning. Edward Nigma, the king of conundrums, duke of puzzles, the cleverest quizmaster Gotham's underbelly has ever seen, is a criminal strategist of some cunning. I wonder who wrote this. Whoever it was, he obviously despised the Riddler. Luckily he turned out to be wrong. Eddie wasn't forever relegated to the status of second-class criminal, as the very next year the character began walking down a path of newfound glory. In 1990, writer Peter Milligan and artist Kieron Dwyer did a 3-part arc in Batman called Dark Knight Dark City, which featured a brand new, ultra-violent and psychotic Riddler. The former loser villain was now a major threat, and pushed Batman to his very limits. In the story it turns out that Nigma has been possessed by a demon, and perhaps Milligan did this as a way to give the finger to the late 80s depiction of the Riddler. He wanted to go in the exact opposite direction of the lame and harmless B-list Riddler, instead portraying the character as a murderous mastermind. This way we got to see what Nigma could potentially be capable of, but without ruining the character, as the more violent tendencies were to blame on the demon. This arc helped to rejuvenate Riddler in the eyes of the fans, but what perhaps played an even bigger role in this endeavor was Batman the Animated Series. This Emmy Award-winning cartoon show, which began to air in 1992, completely revamped Riddler from a more zany character to a sophisticated, suave intellectual. The show had a massive impact on all forms of Batman media, and the comics immediately began to portray Nigma closer to the animated series version. Gone was a cackling Looney Tune, replaced by the cool, stylish smooth talker of the cartoon show. Voice actor John Glover also defined Eddie's smug and arrogant personality, and most actors who's portrayed the character since then have taken cues from his performance. Another aspect from the animated series which eventually became a Riddler staple was his use of advanced technology. Nigma had never been proficient with tech before, but the show depicted him as a former game programmer and computer genius, something which has carried over into many different versions of the Riddler. Around this time, Eddie also made his first jump to a relatively new form of media, namely video games. Several different games based on the animated series were released in the early to mid-90s across a whole slew of different consoles, including the Super Nintendo, Sega Mega Drive, Sega CD, and Game Boy. Eddie, alongside a large host of other rogues from the show, appeared in most of these games. This wasn't all the 1990s had to offer the Riddler, however, as in 1995 he appeared for the second time in a live-action film. It was called Batman Forever, and Nigma was featured as the main villain alongside Two-Face. The actor to play Riddler was comedian and new superstar Jim Carrey, fresh off of his successes with the Ace Ventura films, Dumb and Dumber and The Mask. Much like Edward had done almost 3 decades earlier, Carrey had gone from a relative unknown to a pop culture icon and household name virtually overnight. Carrey's take on Riddler was in style with his previous comedy roles, ludicrously over the top and zany. In other words, more akin to the 60s Riddler as opposed to the depiction from the animated series. Many fans were, and still are to this day, unhappy with this, but nevertheless the film was a huge hit, and the mainstream loved Carrey's turn as the Prince of Puzzlers, itself becoming a bit of an icon, much like Frank Gorshin's version. In 1995, Eddie also returned to the world of gaming when 2 different video games were made based on Batman Forever. One, simply called Batman Forever, released on numerous consoles including the Super Nintendo and the Sega Mega Drive, and the second called Batman Forever the arcade game, which was naturally an arcade game, but it was also ported to the brand new PlayStation the following year. Meanwhile, in the comics of 1995, 95 was a big year for Eddie. Riddler got his backstory revamped and updated by writer Chuck Dixon and penciler Kieran Dwyer. This happened in Detective Comics Annual number 8. The story introduced the idea that Nigma's eccentric criminal tendencies are driven by an obsessive need for attention and a desire to prove himself as somebody who matters. This complex psychological profile of the character carried over into subsequent comics and has now become the standard characterization of Nigma. By the mid-1990s, the Riddler had been firmly re-established as an A-list rogue. While his loser status still lingered in some people's minds for years to come, the world at large and a majority of the fans and creators welcomed back Edward Nigma to the top of the Arkham food chain. The 2000s started a bit slow for the Wizard of Quiz, but that changed quickly in late 2002 when Nigma was featured in the epic and celebrated arc Hush by superstars Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee. This maxi-series pitted the Dark Knight against a gauntlet of his greatest enemies, as well as a new dangerous foe called Hush, who knew Batman's true identity. However, it later turns out that they're all just pawns of the Riddler, the true mastermind, and the one who discovered Batman's identity in the first place and then revealed it to Hush. However, shortly afterwards, Eddie would conveniently enough fall into a brief coma, which caused him to forget Batman's secret. A few years later, Paul Dini, one of the main writers on Batman the Animated Series, had Edward reform during his run on Detective Comics, which started in 2006. Nigma left his old criminal ways behind, and instead pursued a career as a private investigator. This change of professions turned out to be very lucrative for the former puzzle fiend, and in an ironic twist, Nigma even collaborated with his once hated arch-nemesis, the Dark Knight, on a few cases. Still, Eddie would every now and then miss the thrill of a daring caper, but nevertheless he remained on the straight and narrow. That is until he slowly began to succumb to a life of crime once again, just before the big reboot of the DC Universe with the start of the New 52 continuity in 2011. Meanwhile, in other media during this era, Riddler began to appear on the second season of the cartoon show The Batman in 2005. This series featured a Riddler with a brand new design and a bit more sinister personality. Fittingly enough, this darker Riddler was voiced by horror icon Robert Englund, none other than Freddy Krueger himself. A few years later, Riddler also appeared on the animated shows Batman the Brave and the Bold and Young Justice, although primarily in cameos. Meanwhile, over in the world of video games, Batman was basically exploding with several highly popular titles. Nigma showed up as both an antagonist and a playable character in LEGO Batman the video game, released in 2008. It was a spin-off game based on the LEGO Batman minifigures, which began production in 2006. In it, Riddler is the leader of a group of rogues, consisting of Two-Face, Poison Ivy, Mr. Freeze, and Clayface. In this game, Eddie was voiced by Tom Kenny. Riddler returned for 2 sequels, LEGO Batman 2 DC Superheroes and LEGO Batman 3 Beyond Gotham. In 2009, the highly popular Batman Arkham game series was launched, with its first entry, Batman Arkham Asylum. Riddler doesn't physically appear in this game, but he's left tons of riddles and Riddler trophies sprinkled all over the grounds of Arkham for Batman to solve and collect. He also talks to the player via remote radio. His voice work was performed by Wally Wingert, a man who has since become closely associated with the character. Wingert reprised the role for all the sequels, starting with 2011's Batman Arkham City, in which the player finally got to face Nigma. His parts of the game consisted of a series of side missions that involved Batman saving the Riddler's hostages from various elaborate death traps. The riddles and collectible trophies also returned. Eddie then showed up in the 2013 prequel Batman Arkham Origins. In this game we're shown the origin of the Riddler, and it's revealed that he's the head of the GCPD cybercrime unit, while secretly committing criminal acts himself under the moniker Enigma. Again, his parts were separate from the main story. The final entry of the Arkham series, at least by the making of this video, was Batman Arkham Knight, which came out in 2015. In this game, the Riddler was once again the main villain in a series of side missions. These involved saving Catwoman, whom Eddie had kidnapped, and as usual performing various tedious tasks and solving numerous brain-racking puzzles. In 2011, Edward had also appeared in the massive multiplayer online game DC Universe Online, alongside a whole slew of various DC heroes and villains. That same year, over in the comics, we saw the launch of the New 52 continuity, which eventually introduced a brand new take on the Riddler in the pages of Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's year-long epic Batman Zero Year, published between 2013 and 2014. In this arc, Eddie was reimagined as a prominent employee at Wayne Enterprises, who later becomes one of Gotham's first costume supervillains, the Riddler. During the events of Zero Year, Nigma pulled off perhaps the biggest scheme of his entire career, taking complete control of Gotham City, turning it into a wasteland. The Zero Year storyline and his appearances in the Arkham video games solidified Riddler's status as a rogue of a caliber that even rivaled the Joker himself. And to think that 25 years earlier, it was prophesied that the King of Conundrums was destined to remain a second-grade crook forever. Currently at the making of this video, Edward is appearing once again after over 40 years on the small screen in live action. He's featured as a main character and one of the most prominent rogues on the show Gotham, where Eddie is played by Corey Michael Smith. This series apparently took inspiration from the game Arkham Origins, as it portrays Nigma as a GCPD forensic scientist who gradually grows madder and madder, eventually adopting the identity of the Riddler. While certainly more unhinged than the suave animated series take, this version of Nigma is not a buffoonish Looney Tune, and seems to have satiated a majority of the fans' hunger for a proper live-action Riddler. The character was also recently featured in a number of animated films, starting with 2014's Batman Assault on Arkham, set in the Arkham game universe, and 2016's Batman Return of the Caped Crusaders, set in the 1960s television show universe. Conan O'Brien, of all people, voiced Riddler in another animated 2016 feature film, namely the LEGO Batman movie, which included a character in a minor role alongside a horde of other Batrogues. In that same year, Eddie was also featured in an episode of the animated show Justice League Action, where he was depicted as a reformed supervillain working as a private investigator, taking cues from the Paul Dini Detective Comics run. Nigma was voiced by Brent Spinner in the episode. The latest video game to feature the Prince of Puzzlers is the as of yet unfinished episodic point-and-click game Batman the Enemy Within, a sequel to 2016's Batman the Telltale series. This incarnation of Eddie is very different from anything else we've seen with the character. He's portrayed as an old costume villain from before Batman's time, who's now returned as a member of a mysterious organization known as the Pact. And this is where we now stand with the King of Conundrums. The Riddler's history has certainly been a roller coaster of ups and downs. He started off as a new promising rogue, only to fall into total obscurity. Then he suddenly became a superstar, but fell shortly afterwards again, real hard this time. He wasn't forgotten, no, instead he was humiliated and spat on. Which is better, I ask? Riddler rose as quickly as he had fallen though, and began a slow but steady climb towards stardom once again. And now here we are. Enigma could arguably be considered as Batman's second most popular foe after the Joker. So what does the future hold for the Crown Prince of Puzzles? I personally think he's been doing great in the comics for decades, so there's not necessarily any need for improvements there. Riddler has also certainly been favored by television shows, both live action and animation. As for video games, he's been doing pretty good too, especially in more recent years, although we still haven't gotten a game that features Eddie as the main villain. The area where I'd say Riddler's really lacking is movies, both live action and animation. There's yet to be an animated feature film centering around Nigma, and he really needs another shot at a big live action blockbuster movie. I guess we'll just have to see where the character is taken next. I highly doubt he'll ever be considered a B-list loser again. He might suffer through some rougher patches, but Eddie's climbed too far to ever fall down to the bottom again. I really hold no grudge against those 1989 comics I displayed, as by now they're so old, Enigma's come so far since then that they don't cause any harm anymore and can simply be viewed as a small part of the Riddler's fascinating history. Let me know in the comments which version of Riddler is your favorite. Is it Frank Gorshin, the animated series, Jim Carrey, the Arkham games? Also, let me know what you think about this series. Do you think it's interesting to explore the history of the main Bat-rogues, or just boring repetition and a waste of time? And as always, remember, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.